Good afternoon. I'm Aarti Jhaveri. I serve on the board of SACHI, Society for Art and Cultural Heritage of India. On behalf of SACHI, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. Before I introduce our afternoon's guest speaker, I would like to thank the leadership of the Asian Art Museum, Jay Shu and Robert Mintz, Education Director Deborah Clearwaters, and our primary partner for SACHI events, the Programs Department at the Asian Art Museum, led by Alison Wyckoff, for their long-standing support of SACHI. Our very, very warm and special thanks to Indra Mangal, who has worked tirelessly to coordinate today's event, to John O'Shea for AV support, and to Matt and Scott, who are working behind the scenes here. I would also like to thank museum participants Abby Chen, Head of Contemporary Art at the Asian Art Museum, and Mark Mayer, Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art, who will be in conversation with Shanay Jhaveri. SACHI also extends thanks and appreciation to all its sponsors for their generous support for today's event. Lata Krishnan and Ajay Shah, Betty and Bruce Alberts, Michelle and Jared Baird, Sudhnya Shroff and Nikhil Jakadar, Geeta and Ashok Vaish. I have to read out Shanay's introduction because he is so accomplished, it is really overwhelming. Our guest speaker, Shanay Jhaveri, was raised in Mumbai, India, in a family of art lovers and collectors. He graduated from Brown University with a BA in Art Semiotics and the History of Art and Architecture, and holds a PhD from the Royal College of Art. His first exhibition, Companionable Silences 2013, at the Palais de Tokyo, featured a selected group of works by non-Western women artists, all of whom lived and worked in Paris in the 1920s. Shanay's exhibition in London, titled Everything We Do is Music at the Drawing Room 2017, explored the impact of Indian classical music on the work of artists. He has curated film programs for the Dhaka Art Summit, the Film at Lincoln Center, and Tate Modern. His books, which examine cross-cultural influences between India and the West, include Western Artists and India, Creative Inspirations in Art and Design, Outside of Films on India, 1950 to 1990, and America, Films from Elsewhere. He has published widely in numerous art journals and is a contributing editor for Frieze magazine. Shanay Jhaveri is currently Assistant Curator of South Asian Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, where he organized the 2018 Roof Commission, Huma Bhaba, We Come in Peace, and curated Phenomenal Nature, Mrinalini Mukherjee, at the Med Breuer in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Shanay Jhaveri today.
I would also like to extend my appreciation to SACHI for the invitation and their warm hospitality, and the Asian Art Museum for hosting this event. So now for over the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Met's ongoing relationship with South Asia, but with a focus on their modern and contemporary art program, since I joined the museum 3.5 years ago as their first incumbent curator of South Asian modern and contemporary art. So the Met was established in 1870, and here we have a view of it. It houses around 2 million art objects and has had an engaged relationship with South Asia. Comprised of 18 departments, the museum has 8 departments currently that actively collect work from the region. Most of this is classical or pre-modern, and I'm just going to cycle through a few examples that you'll see in various other departments' collections. So this is Shiva from our Asian art collection, a miniature of Shah Jahan from Islamic art, works that in our musical objects department, and then arms and armor. And so that brings us to the Modern and Contemporary Department, which was established by Henry Geldzahler in 1967. And it has had a slightly belated relationship to South Asia and the international. It was really only with the coming of Sheena Wagstaff from the Tate in 2012 as the new chairperson of Modern and Contemporary Art that the focus and the remit of the department expanded to include South Asian modern and contemporary, and my role was instituted. Sheena also created 2 other regional positions, one for Latin America and another for the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. So when I joined the museum, my responsibilities involved adding to the museum's very modest holdings of work from the region, but also contributing actively to their exhibitions program and thinking about commissions and special projects. While our program was while Sheena joined in 2012, we took over the Marcel Breuer Old Whitney building on Madison Avenue, which was inaugurated in 2016 as a temporary venue to showcase the department's activities, its acquisitions, and also demonstrate its vision. And so here you have an image of the Breuer. So I'm going to first begin with talking about the acquisition program and how I have evolved that and developed a strategy for the museum, and then move on to exhibitions and special projects. So when I arrived at the museum, the holdings of modern and contemporary South Asian art were fairly modest. And I was presented with the task of writing a collection strategy that would articulate how the museum would move forward and acquire work from the region. Having not had a sustained relationship and collected work over a period of time, there were many, many gaps in the collection. And so how does one acknowledge and work with these gaps, especially when a museum like the Met is coming to a conversation that's happening in the region, but in a belated fashion? And so what I thought was that it would not be possible to build, or even desirable, really, to build a completist encyclopedic collection of South Asian modern and contemporary art, but rather really acknowledge that the collection we will have is one that will be necessarily fragmented. And so build groups or clusters of work that speak to each other in various ways. And so one of the kind of groupings that I've thought of and that has governed a trajectory of the collecting is to think about artists who've had a transnational life, or who've lived in different geographies or in different countries. And a work that speaks very clearly to that, and an artist who has had that kind of trajectory is Zarina, based in New York, but now living in London, and this incredible portfolio of 36 woodcut prints called Home is a Foreign Place. This would be complemented by a work by Anwar Jalal Shemza, who was a Pakistani artist who lived and worked in England and passed away in 1985. You can also see a pictographic relationship in terms of the formal aesthetic of the work, which brings them together. Rashid Arain, another transnational artist, Pakistani, living in England and working with a minimalist vocabulary for his sculpture. Another trajectory which I'm interested in is looking at alternative modernist practices. So here is a work by the lesser-known Bangladeshi artist Rashid Chaudhry, who was a textile artist. And I felt it was very important to include his work in the collection, to represent Bangladesh in our holdings alongside India and Pakistan, but also acknowledge a medium like textile, someone working in it in a fine arts modality, but also thinking about a modernist aesthetic outside of what is generally outside what are the generally predetermined notions or conditions that are considered modernist work. So another artist in that way is Mrinalini Mukherjee, whose retrospective I curated this summer, and I will be talking about that a little bit later, but Mukherjee as well suggests a different kind of art-making practice within the art history of India. She was working with, again, fiber, a non-conventional medium within the sculptural landscape of mid to late 20th century India, and the kind of marginalization she faced, but continued to persist working in this manner. Nasreen Mohammadi, another artist who worked in a very particular aesthetic, clearly engaged with aesthetics, with some of the aesthetic tenets of Western modernism, but then engaging them in her own way. And it was her work that we inaugurated the Met Breuer exhibition program with, which I will talk about a little bit later. Here is a work and another trajectory of collecting, which is to think about works that speak to the historic collection of the Met, because one has to keep in mind the chronology and the classical work that we have. And a work like this by Vivan Sundaram from 1968, very agilely, as you can see from the title, braids together something as specific as Persian miniature, but with the moving image practice of the experimental American filmmaker Stan Brakhage. So there is that group of works as well. And then another grouping, which I feel is quite urgent and necessary, is if we are engaged with the region in its contemporary context, is to acquire work by artists who are speaking to the restive social and political conditions that are part of the landscape of the region. So here we have a work by Lala Rook, and we're the first American institution to acquire work by Lala, who is a very important Pakistani artist who passed away in 2017 and again has come to prominence only of late. And this is a work called Mirror Image 123, and it was a work she made in reaction to the demolition of the Babri Masjid. And it's a minimal work, but what you see here is a detail of what is a three-panel or a triptych. And Lala collected media imagery of the destruction of the Babri Masjid from both Indian and Pakistani newspapers, and then collaged them and blackened them out to kind of talk about how there's a perpetuation of a certain kind of narrative through mediated representations of ethnic violence. And so the work is responsive and critical to what was happening in the region at that time. Next year, we'll be putting on view a work that has been gifted to the museum by a remarkable group of women called The Lightning Testimonies by Amar Kanwar, and it is a work that explores the history of sexual violence against women in India since partition. We also have Nalini Milani's work called In Search of Vanished Blood, which is another moving image installation that investigates hierarchical and ethnic violence in the region. That said, another group of works is responding to broader issues that are not only confronting the region, but also the rest of the world. This was articulated and addressed by this remarkable installation that we received as a gift, and I had the pleasure of showing in the main building's modern and contemporary galleries. It's immersive installation by the sculptor Ranjini Shettar and called Seven Ponds and a Few Raindrops. The work is really about the threatened ecology of India and speaking about climate crisis in a poetic fashion. And it was also coincidentally the first work by a modern and contemporary South Asian artist to be shown in the museum's modern and contemporary galleries, which happened in 2018. So here is a close-up detail. Ranjini works with steel, which she manipulates and covers with fabric that she's stained with different kinds of natural pigments. So I think along with, of course, adding work to the museum's collection, what is extremely important and something I was quite insistent on when I joined the museum was that these pieces are seen on view alongside major works from the collection and from other parts of the world, because it's one thing to acquire, but it's another to ensure that they are seen and they're contextualized. And it is through this persistence of presence that we will be able to maybe in some way shift the perceptions and understandings of Western audiences of South Asian art. So here we had the Rashi Chaudhary work that was gifted to us on view on the threshold of the Modern and Contemporary galleries earlier this year. And it was a work that you saw before you entered the Modern and Contemporary galleries. And as soon as you went in, you would either see Paul Klee or you would see Picasso, references that Chaudhary was looking at when he was making his work. We currently have on view an exhibition at the Met Breuer on the second floor called Home is a Foreign Place, Recent Acquisitions in Context, and it takes this idea further of how does one integrate work from the non-West alongside work from the Western canon. So really one of the privileges and what excited me about joining the museum was the opportunity to take a received art history, so one that I know of the region, but also a global art history, and how those could be rethought in an embodied and active manner and in our galleries. And so this show, which was a collective group effort of all my colleagues across the department, was a way of questioning and thinking through ideas of how work can be presented alongside other work that it's not necessarily naturally seen or expected to be witnessed with. So the show takes its title from Zarina's portfolio of woodcuts, Home is a Foreign Place, and the enduring concern of the entire show is about home and what does home mean, and the differing conditions of how home is constituted in someone's world, whether it's a physical place, whether it's an imaginary place, migrancy, displacement, exile, or all other conditions that are explored in the presentation. But really the first thing you see as you walk out of the elevators is this pairing of Zarina's work with Jasper Johns, and we felt that it's a provocation in terms of juxtaposition. It's not that they're visually similar, but suggest something about nationhood and nationality, and we wanted to kind of see how people respond and react to that. Similarly, here we have the Shemza work alongside the work of Salowa Rado Shuker, a very important modern Lebanese artist, and pictographic work by Rothko. So again, a set of concerns which are formal, but then also going beyond the formal and asking to think about it in more conceptually. And so maybe not the most expected way to encounter Rothko with Shuker and Shemza. Or Simran Gill, whose work, My Own Private Encore, is a remarkable set of 90 photographs that we're showing in 2 rotations of 45 that talk about the ruins of modernity and development in the Malaysian peninsula, and seen alongside Robert Smithson's work. So Gill's work, My Own Private Encore, is composed of these photographs, black and white silver gelatin prints, and the subject is this abandoned set of vacation homes that Gill chanced upon in Port Dickson, where she lives. And what she noticed was that panes of glass had been removed from the windows and placed against the wall because local thieves had stolen the steel armatures to sell on the black market, but had so diligently and carefully placed the glass against the wall that when you see the light passing through it, it casts these shadows almost like like a minimalist installation. So she documents those, and then pairing that alongside Smithson's work was a suggestion of thinking about maybe the formal properties of the work. So that's really where we are with the acquisition program, and these are just a few highlights that I've presented, and it's something that we continue to develop, and it's something that is a very important part of the museum's relationship and commitment to the region. Now, alongside that is, as I mentioned, the exhibition program and the special projects. And before I joined, Sheena inaugurated what is the Met's current Roof Commission program with a project by Imran Qureshi, a Pakistani artist. Sheena had come upon his work when she went to the Sharjah Art Biennial, and based on that, invited Imran to come and make this work on the Met's roof that you see over here, which required Imran to paint on the Met's stone flooring, and he was drawing on traditions of Persian miniature, the details, the ornamental flourishes. But when seen from afar, you see the work as something else. It is, and it's only when you go closer and you inhabited the actual space of the roof that you got to look at the detail that he was referencing from those miniatures. This was followed by the inaugural exhibition at the Met Breuer, which was a retrospective of Nasreen Mohammadi, an artist who worked quite fastidiously in an aesthetic idiom that was quite singular from everything else that was happening in mid-20th century India at that point. Her peers were primarily doing figurative narrative painting, and Mohammadi, when based in Baroda, was making these very elaborate, refined, minimal grid drawings. And of course, they have a connection to Western modernism, but she was also looking at Islamic and South Asian historic architecture and also other architecture that she encountered in the Gulf where she stayed. And Mohammadi had a very transnational life, and that sense of cosmopolitanism informed the references that she digested and transposed into her work. And here is a view of that exhibition. And I think with Sheena choosing to inaugurate the Breuer exhibition program with the practice of Mohammadi left a very strong indication of how that program would develop, which is to rethink who are the artists that have defined modernism, to go beyond what have been the defining factors of that movement. And so it was really keeping that in mind that I started to evolve or think about our exhibition program that has resulted in Mrinali Mukherjee's exhibition that happened this summer. But before I get to Mukherjee, I wanted to talk about the Roof Commission that I was tasked with, which was last year in 2018, where I invited the Pakistani artist Huma Bhabha to be a respondent. And Huma is now based in America, in Poughkeepsie, so it was quite convenient to work with her, and quite a pleasant train ride upstate. So we invited Huma in the summer of 2017, and I made my first studio visit with Sheena in July, and this is what Huma proposed to us, these two drawings, which had a very clear and fairly articulated vision that she had for what the commission would be, which would be this configuration of two forms. And Huma was really thinking of the Met's quite awkward roof space, but rather iconic as well, as something of a landing space or a theater or some kind of platform in which you would see two sculptural forms or objects in relation or conversation to one another. And this is really what was the entry point for Huma when thinking about the space and responding to it. She wanted to very much situate the sculptures in relation to the museum, but also to the broader context of New York. So as is with Huma's practice, she makes the works herself to scale in her studio, and then they're further, for the roof, cast in bronze because they would have to endure the 6 months of being on the Met roof. But also, Huma works with industrial materials. She works with cork, styrofoam, air-dried clay, a garbage bag in this case. And so there was something about transforming what are these generally temporary materials into something that is more permanent, and the shape and form that they take in her sculptures would suggest something else. So they were cast in a foundry in upstate New York and made into bronze sculptures. And here are some process photographs. And this is what was the result. An installation called We Come in Peace that comprised of 2 sculptures. These are the 2 constituent sculptures of the entire installation. A tall 12-foot, 5-headed, intersex figure called We Come in Peace that shares the title of the installation, and a prostrate form called Bane Arm. Now, the Bane Arm form, which you can see here from the frontal view, is a form that Huma has repeatedly returned to. She first developed it in 2002 and then made iterations of it in 05 and 06. And at that time, she said that the work was a response or a memorial to the victims of the wars that were happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we felt that when thinking of what would be appropriate sculptures for the Roof Commission, Huma was very keen to return to this form and monumentalize it, because she sees that there is a persistence of those concerns still. It's not that that is part of the past. It's still issues and concerns that are very much in our contemporary. And so the desire to return to that form and to monumentalize it, or to make it maybe what one could call a counter-monument. And that was one of the very interesting aspects of putting this this installation together, is that while Huma was developing it, there was a very engaged conversation happening around the taking down of Confederate statues, and the idea of what is a monument, who gets to be represented in a monument, the idea of the counter-monument, what does monumentality constitute? So those were some of the formal questions that Huma was engaging with this work. There were also other political concerns regarding, when you say we come in peace, it suggests an arrival, people coming from elsewhere. And what does that mean within the very fraught contemporary political landscape of America today, with issues of migrancy and Islamophobia? Because even there is an ambiguity to the form Bane Arm. One doesn't really know whether it's a dead body bag, is it someone in a prostrate form, is it a broken sculpture? So again, there is a kind of plethora of readings that one could ascribe to the work. There is, of course, the phrase "we come in peace" that is oft uttered in science fiction, and that is another strand or way of drawing people into or engaging with the installation. And here are just 2 references of aesthetically what Huma is interested in when looking at science fiction film, but also The Day the Earth Stood Still was a film where there is a miscommunication and understanding between the aliens who visit and the humans, and the phrase that is uttered is "we come in peace," but it is misunderstood. So this idea of encounter and cross-cultural encounter, or encounters which go beyond what we're familiar with, do we have the language for that? That is something that was really at the core of the installation. Now, the tall figure, also, one of the other factors that we keep in mind when inviting artists for the Roof Commission is, while they're of course responding to the specificity of the site, thinking about the New York skyline, the contemporary social landscape in which their work is being made, is also the museum's historic collection. And Huma's work has always demonstrated a great knowledge, interest, and affinity for historic figurative sculpture. And that made her the right artist to kind of make this installation in the moment that she did. And here are I'm just going to show you 2 very quick examples or references that I see in Huma's work and that we discussed. So We Come in Peace is a multi-headed form, a form that has different heads, and each head has a different expression. Is it in a pained repose, or is it strident? Is it bellowing, or is it in a state of distress? Again, there are these ambiguous states it's kind of moving between, and the multi-headed nature of it, for me, recalled the Lord Vishnu. The conical breasts of the figure reminded me of this female power statue from Mali. One could think of the hands of Bane Arm in relation to Rodin. So again, there is this plethora of references that Huma has digested and brought into her sculptures. Smithson, one could think of post-minimalist sculpture. And also with Bane Arm, what was very interesting is that when we were wheeling the work into the museum, a lot of people commented on the elegance of the drapery of the garbage bag and the painting of it, and it started to resonate with a lot of classical European sculpture, which has draped fabric on it. So really, if one thinks about it, the Bane Arm form, you have maybe Rodin and the hands, Smithson in the tail, and a host of European sculpture in the middle. So she's contending with a range of artistic, sculptural, historic responses when making the work. So we installed the work in March, and within 3 hours of installing it, this is what we were confronted with. And in a way, seeing the work, and this was opening day, so seeing the work in these extreme climatic conditions further added to the kind of political exigency that the work suggests, or was sitting at the core of the piece. And I think for us it was very interesting to see how audiences were engaging and reacting with it, because what we found was that there were many points of entry for people and viewers to the work. Children found the installation very compelling. They were very excited by it and, thought of science fiction, aliens, Marvel movies, whatnot. But then there is, of course, a set of the audience who were reading it in relation to the very complex conversation that's happening downstairs in our historic galleries. And then there is the more art historical way of thinking about it in terms of monumentality, monuments. And then lastly, of course, in relation to our political moment. And so it was one way of engaging the historic collection and the present, and not overly literalizing, and giving our audiences some space to engage with a contemporary program that is thinking about, or attempting to think about, the museum and its present moment in a considered manner. So now that brings me to another project that I worked for, which was the retrospective show of Mrinalini Mukherjee that opened at the Met Breuer this summer from June, and it closed in September. And it was the first international retrospective of Mukherjee. Mukherjee was an Indian sculptor born in 1949. She was born to two artist parents, Binod Bihari Mukherjee and Leela Mansukhani. Binod Bihari Mukherjee was a professor at Shantiniketan and an important figure of Bengali modernism. And Leela Mansukhani was a lesser-known artist, but also a sculptor working in an urban context at that time. Now, Mukherjee spent her childhood between Dehradun, where her mother was a teacher at Welham's Girls' Boarding School, and Shantiniketan, where her father was. And so it was moving between these two geographies, the foothills of the Himalayas and the landscape of West Bengal, that made a huge impression, or an indelible impression, on Mukherjee's aesthetic sensibility. This was further nurtured or nourished by the pedagogy that was in place at Shantiniketan, which was instituted by Rabindranath Tagore, and emphasized ecological awareness and thinking about nature, not only doing classes outside under trees, but also thinking about nature as a recourse or a source of inspiration. So really, nature in all its forms becomes the abiding source of inspiration for Mukherjee as she develops her practice. So Mukherjee, initially, after flirting with a career in medicine, decides to become an artist. She concedes that she's the daughter of two artists and goes to the Baroda Faculty of Fine Arts in Gujarat. And over there, she begins her first degree in painting, and then eventually it was through her engagement with the then Dean of the Faculty of Fine Arts, K.G. Subramaniam, that she begins to work in the sculptural idiom that one sees in the show. Now, she does a post-diploma in mural design, and it is in this diploma program led by K.G. Subramaniam that Mukherjee begins to work with an unconventional material like natural rope. Now, what is to be said about K.G. Subramaniam's pedagogy that had a very important impact on Mukherjee was that he encouraged all his students to engage with what he called the living traditions of India, which is the host of artisanal and craft practices that were and still continue to flourish in the country, and to not think of them as low art or to dismiss them, but to use that material and integrate it more formally with what they are exploring from what they know is happening in the West. And so it was really having that kind of encouragement that Mukherjee took to working with natural rope. And you can see that it was at these fine art fairs where she was interacting with local craftspeople that she first got to engage or use rope. So here is an installation view of the exhibition, or the first gallery space that one walks into. I was very keen to do a chronological presentation of Mukherjee's work to demonstrate to audiences the kind of sophistication, how her practice evolved and arrived at a level of not only formal integrity and elegance, but also intellectual sophistication. And so the first work in the show that you see is Squirrel, and it's, I don't know, all right, how to use the clicker. Anyways, it's the work you see there. It's a work from her graduation student show, and which we had specially restored for the exhibition. And I felt that it was a crucial work to have because it announced really from the start a couple of things that became quite important for Mukherjee. One was an interest in nature. It's a very literal evocation of something that one sees in nature, which is a squirrel form. And you see that with the kind of body that she builds out, and it's a bricolier kind of creature that she's created with using brushes and, you know, a basket, because she's still evolving her technique. But the other two things that one sees is that her interest in three-dimensionality and very much wanting to situate what she does as having the properties of sculpture, so volume, occupying space, not thinking of her work as wall hanging. And it takes her some time to kind of shift from that register, but it's really something that she's interested in really from the get-go. And then the last is that she worked off very rudimentary armature, so in this case, just a bamboo stick from which the rope would fall, and knotting was her primary gesture. So Mukherjee was not a weaver. She never studied weaving, and the work is not meant to mimic woven form either. Next to it is a work that you see from 1975 called Waterfall, where already the elements start to abstract themselves slightly, and also she starts to introduce color. And then in 1972, she moves to New Delhi, where she starts to live in Nizamuddin East and engages with a whole range of other artists, architects, practitioners, and gets a range of commissions for public spaces to work on, which helps sustain herself, because she was very fastidious in saying that she's not interested in taking on design work or being a teacher. She was very committed to her practice as an artist. And so these commissions allowed her to evolve her technique, which then transforms. And so here you have some more detailed shots of squirrel and waterfall, and you can see that knotting is the primary technique, and how she starts to create volume from manipulating the knots and the varying the distances, or the macrame techniques that she's engaged with, and which she really learned from participating in those fine art fairs. So you see crafting, or a craft technique, as being very much embedded in the practice. So here now, by 1977, the practice makes a huge conceptual leap in terms of its interest in nature. She moves from thinking about it in a literal way in terms of the biomorphic, thinking about energetics, ideas of transformation, transfiguration, the way nature changes itself and evolves itself. And so you see that in a work called Black Formation 2. The other thing that this work announces quite obviously is an interest in sexuality and erotica. And throughout Mukherjee's practice, you will see that her works are beings or forms in which male and female sexual attributes coexist. So sexual difference is a condition that she fully inhabits and lets her work inhabit as well. The other thing that Mukherjee starts to now look to is classical Indian sculpture. And here is just one comparison that you see. She's traveling around the country with her then husband and looking at a lot of temple architecture, and she is inspired by it, but it is not in a literal, mimetic, or illustrative manner, but rather she is interpreting the forms that she sees and creating her own version of that in what was then a contemporary context. So the thing that Mukherjee was very invested in, as one sees, and so the images you have here, so this one and the previous one, are images we found in her archive. So her husband and she would take very detailed pictures of what she was interested in these temples, and so that gives us a sense of how her sensibility was developing. And Mukherjee was very interested in what one could call the generic representations of earthly spirits or female nymphs or fairies, or that mythic substratum of personas that occupy the Indian myth, the Indian historic imaginary, but are not connected or committed to a particular form of representing a deity or god or a goddess of, say, Hinduism. And you can see that from the titles she gives her works as one translates them: Nag Devta, serpent deity; Black Devi or black goddess; sitting deity, sitting god Purush or man; Yogini, Pari or fairy; Yogini, female seeker. So again, there is an interest in a broader representation of these forms that are the creative life forces that are part of Indian mythology, rather than a desire to make representations of gods and goddesses. And what you see across the 70s, arriving into the 80s, is the technical advancement Mukherjee makes, which is that she moves gradually off the wall, and those three works over there, Nag Devta, Black Deity, and Sitting Deity, are very reminiscent of bas relief that you would see in Indian temples, so this idea or this connection to mural. But then she goes to off the wall, and then eventually she manages to get them ceiling suspended. And they take on this kind of anthropomorphic, totemic quality, which will only grow in scale as the practice goes further, as you will see. Now, I'm just going to say a little bit about the design of the exhibition. As you can see through these pictures, is that when thinking about putting the show together, I was aware that it's going to be presented at the Met Breuer, which is a modernist building par excellence. It exerts a kind of character and a certain kind of aesthetic tenets that are connected to modernism. And so what I see in Mukherjee's practice is a subversion of modernist form. It's not a rejection of it, but a subversion of it. And I wanted to bring that into the bearing of how I made the exhibition. So what Mukherjee really does is that while she maintains symmetry in her work, she brings in curves and these sinuous kind of organic shifts in the practice. And so we wanted to have that be reflected in the exhibition, so bring a kind of gentleness into what is generally a very harsh space. And so the curtains were one, but the other was creating this pathway, which would make you feel as if you're walking through a garden or in an entirely immersive space that once, where you encounter and, come upon her beings. So here is another example of how Mukherjee is looking at classic Indian iconography and interpreting that in what is now a firmly articulated visual idiom that is her own. And it is a visual idiom that brings three factors together, which I see. One is looking at craft. The other is looking at a modernist aesthetic, and the third is classical Indian iconography. So it's the braiding together of these three things that allows us, or allows her really, to arrive at what is quite a remarkable piece called Yogani, which has symmetry and balance, but also sensuousness and a kind of sensuality to it. And here are two other works from that period, Shri and Apsara, who I saw as kind of resonant with one another and hence place them together. But again, one can see that the forms that she's evolving, they almost exude a sense of being in a state of transfiguration. So again, this idea of the phenomenal forces of nature as acting and as being constantly in some kind of motion. Erotica and sexuality remain persistent through the work. So here is a view of the first gallery. I really wanted audiences to come in and really get a sweep of the practice as you arrive and see the incredible accomplishment she makes in a very short period of about 10 years of working with this medium. So as one moves into the 80s, the works have become bigger and more ambitious. And at this point, I'm just going to say a little bit about her technique, which you can see here, is that Mukherjee worked without any preparatory drawings. So there was no roadmap that she would make before she starts to kind of make the work. The work would be done intuitively and done by her by hand. So she worked alone. Her husband and a daily wage worker called Budia would help her acquire the natural rope called sani or shan, or translated as more generically hemp in English. She would then, they would buy that from a market in North Delhi and bring it and uncurl it for her. And then she would hang it off a very rudimentary armature and then start to knot. And what was remarkable is that she was able to engineer those forms really intuitively and on her own. And she left behind very fastidious instructions, as you can see from the sheets that we found in her archive, as to how the works should be installed, because she really saw them as, sculpture that is installation. And one thing that she always specified was that the work should not be on pedestals, because she never saw Indian sculpture as being part of a tradition of being on a pedestal. She wanted the work to be on the ground. And that was really one of the defining factors for how we evolved the presentation of the show, which was that I wanted everything directly on the floor, which in the context of a museum creates many issues and concerns, which is conservation, security, all of these other things. And so that's how we evolved this idea of a pathway that would be a visual marker to suggest that you don't go beyond a certain threshold when you get to see them. And really for Mukherjee, she said she loved the feeling of when you go into the inner sanctum of any sacred space and you come upon an iconic presence and the sense of awe it bestills in you. And that's really something that we wanted to kind of achieve in the experience of the show, where you would have moments where you would come around and just see a single work, or you would come into maybe this section of the show, which is the middle, where you see a large grouping of her works, or the largest works that she ever made. While she fully resolved the works, the idea of frontality was something that was important to Mukherjee, because when you are in either a temple, mosque, church, wherever, you come upon the icon in a frontal sense. And so that's why a lot of the works are oriented in the way they are. So when you encounter this grouping of works, you can see the progression Mukherjee has made, not only in terms of scale, but something else that was revealed to us to me while I was researching her work, was an interest in theater. She was interested in no theater, Kathakali, Theam, how costumes are made on bodies, armatures create a presence for a performer's body. And so those elements start to then kind of distill themselves in the later works. Then also the other thing that Mukherjee was never afraid of was going into the grotesque. She was very accommodating of something that challenged aesthetic paradigms or sensibilities. And so she really takes that to, she actualizes it when you have something like Rudra, which is the purple work in the middle, which is the deity of terror. So this is what I would say is the most ambitious moment in terms of scale for her fiber ceiling suspended work. But as you move into the 90s, you see Mukherjee now being able to make freestanding work, which was a real goal for the practice, to arrive at freestanding sculpture. And at this moment, the work started to take on a slightly more humanoid profile. So as with Woman on Peacock, you can see it has a much more discernible form. Also, Woman on Peacock speaks to, again, her interest in classical iconography and she being playful in it and creating a female form or spirit that has a vehicle or a vahan, which is not mostly, at least the way she saw it, as attributed to many female spirits or deities. The accompanying work next to it, which I have, and she also called that work A Woman Astride a Man. So again, the interest in sex and sexuality and coupling and unison is very much a part of her work. And then Push, which I paired alongside it, is very clear in its evocation, but she very coyly said when she spoke about it that it was really the burgeoning of a magnolia flower that was her inspiration and really nothing else. And yeah, sure, it's a flower. But I think what's so interesting about her interest or representation of sexuality and female sexuality is something about its potentiality. It's seen as surging, rippling. It's in states of ascension or descension. It's not about orgasmic pleasure, but really what gathers and builds in arriving at a state of ecstasy. Now, by the mid-90s, Mukherjee is unable to continue working with fiber because the rope which she's using is starting to get polluted with plastic, so it doesn't have the pliability she's used to. And so and also I forgot to mention that she dyed all the rope to the color she wanted at a local dry cleaner, but she was using chemicals. And now all the chemical dyes that she was using by the 90s were banned in India, so she was forcibly being made to start thinking about other mediums. And so she starts to work with clay through a series of residencies and opportunities. And so the first work she made in 1995, which was a non-fiber work, was called Lotus Pond, which is the work you see between Van Shringar and Van Shri, which was a 13-piece installation of wood-fired, not wood-fired, but clay, just naturally fired clay. And it was really her starting to experiment with this medium, and it again very literally talks about her interest in nature. But the thing that you see introduced over here is the idea of ornamentation and decoration, but as suggestive of something else, and that will develop further as she moves on with the ceramics. So here you can see again a pairing of the largest freestanding fiber work she did, Van Raja 2, alongside growing ceramics that she was making in a residency in the Netherlands, because there weren't really the technical facilities in India for Mukherjee to use to make the work at the scale that she wanted. Now, with this group of 3 ceramics you see on the floor, Earth Bloom, Fluorescence 1, Fluorescence 2, I really see another kind of quality entering the practice, which is a slightly more pernicious, violent quality that will develop further. Also, the glaze she used, chromium oxide, is a deeply toxic one, which she was cautioned against using, but she persisted and used it and resulted in this kind of unsettling greenish orangish color. And so that idea of nature also not just being beautiful, but there being some kind of other sinister sense to it is latent in the practice that becomes more prominent as one goes forward. This group of works, the Night Blooms, is the largest set of ceramics Mukherjee ever did, and they were very important for me to bring together. They're a group of 6, but we managed to bring 4 together, and it's the first time they're being seen since they were exhibited after she made them in 2000. And here you see the humanoid profile return from the later fiber works, but you also see this interest in decoration and ornamentation return, where you have this natural foliage covering the body, kind of consuming the seated male-female form. Also at that time, Mukherjee was traveling around Southeast Asia. She went to Borobudur and saw the seated bodhisattvas over there, and then she was in Cambodia and she saw the ruins of Angkor Wat and the other temples being consumed by natural foliage. And so those are some other references that kind of informed this group of works. Mukherjee could not continue working with ceramic when she went back to India in the scale that she was accustomed to after the 2 residencies in the Netherlands, and so she changes her medium yet again and starts working with bronze. And it's so many visitors across the lead time of the show spoke about her ability to move so agilely between these 3 very distinct media. Her approach, of course, with bronze, like with the other 2 mediums, was unconventional. At this point, I want to say that her mother was a sculptor and worked with bronze, and I think seeing her mother work in that mode encouraged her to work with bronze as well. Now, with bronze, she begins tentatively and then moves up further, but the thing that she really wanted to do was to mold and create details in the wax. And even though she was told by many other sculptors that once it's fired, it would lose all of those details, she still persisted in using the lost wax process. And then once the molded forms came out of the fire, she would then use tools from the local orthodontist that she used to go to create details that she wanted. And unlike most, so here you have her working and you can see her using the tools to create the textures and details that she was after. But the thing one sees and becomes aware of is that Mukherjee never made accomplished conventional bronze sculptors a full form that emerged out of the kiln, out of the furnace. What she did was she would cast a component, make various components, and then weld them together. So really, her bronzes are incredibly fragile. They're all unique because they're these configurations of all these multiple components. And her last series was called the Palmscape series. And again, this sinister quality that one saw emerging in the ceramics becomes more latent in these last series of bronzes, which look like almost petrified fossil remains of like an apocalyptic landscape, things that are writhing and trying to become something when one doesn't know what it is. So I chose to end the show with what I called a coda, in which all the 3 media were brought together to see and to have a sense of a kind of a whole universe in one scale, to see it in one kind of sweep. And really, what I also wanted to suggest is the kind of persistence of certain visual motifs and interests that you see across, this interest in nature. And nature is not elegiac or sublime, but really one that is full of potential. And it's full of life, and it's erotic. And that's really something that Mukherjee really saw, and I think wanted to emphasize through her work, is that we're surrounded by potentiality. And how do we engage and recognize that? The other thing that makes her work so remarkable, and I felt, important to show is then, of course, how it transgresses so many different historical, formal, aesthetic categories and collapses our very particular understanding of what is a modernist aesthetic, what is sculpture, soft sculpture, what is sculpture that looks at the historic, but also then feels alien or suggesting some sense of the future. And so really that was something that I felt that was important to show as part of the Breuer program. And in a way, she and Mohammadi are twin projects, because they're both these women working in an Indian context dominated by narrative painting in aesthetics that were very much their own, idioms that they developed that were their own, and also were without any kind of financial success at the time they were working, persisted. And so they really sit at the two ends of the spectrum, but are also complements to one another. And there was also a nice story that Mohammadi moved to Baroda in 72 and Mukherjee moved to Delhi in 72. And so Mukherjee initially lived in the Barsati, or the one studio apartment that Mohammadi had. So that was a nice little anecdotal story. So what I've shared with you is a commissioned project, a retrospective exhibition that I worked on, and then now a third strain of programming, which is special projects or interventionary projects, where contemporary art, alive contemporary art, is taken into the museum's historic galleries. And so that was a project that for me took an embodied form with a collaboration with our live arts curator, Limor Tomer, when we invited the performance artist Nikhil Chopra to come and develop a project for the museum, and he did so this September. And it was a 9-day performance project where he lived in the Met continuously for 9 days. And here you see him just before he enters. So I think the brief that we offered Nikhil was that knowing his practice, and his practice has always been interested in ideas of migrancy, iterancy, the nomad, and a sense of dislocation. And the Met for me is this. It's its own geography. It has organized the world and cultures to its own logic. And you're crossing all these national frontiers and imagined boundaries. And how has this come about? So I was really keen to have an artist come in and think about that, to move through those spaces and see if one can bear down upon it, reflect upon it. And he was game. And so he evolved over a year and a half of research, a very particular itinerary that he would use when he comes in through the museum, because especially when now I'm asking an artist to move through the museum, nothing can not be pre-planned, right down to like the space that he was going to occupy in our historic galleries. And so after processes of negotiation and sharing with our colleagues, we and him determining what he wanted to do, Nikhil decided that his 9-day performance would lead to 3 spaces in the museum. The first is going to be the Temple of Dender. The second was a corridor space between the modern and contemporary galleries and the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. And then the last was the Lehman Court, which is part of the museum dedicated to a private collection that was a bequest. Now, the role that he took on, or the character, he would change characters as he moved through the museum, and the character he began with was of this migrant laborer or this nomad who was moving his things into the museum. And so here you have him moving it in. Here he is, after moving each thing one time and going through security, just like everybody else, sitting in the Great Hall and kind of contemplating where is he and what is he doing here? And then he would carry all of this and set up his abode or his tent in the Temple of Dender. And so it was this large piece of cotton fabric that took the shape of a tent in which he would lay out his wares and start drawing. So the central act of his performance, besides being this character and investigating the logic of the museum, was also to make a large landscape drawing. Landscape drawing has always been at the core of Nikhil's practice, and it has evolved and changed across the different projects that he's done. And so that was something that he developed for the Met, and the title of the piece was Lands, Waters, and Skies. So in each of the 3 locations, he was going to tackle one component. In the temple, it was going to be the sky. In the threshold space, it was going to be land, and then finally water. So here you have him standing and drawing the sky in the tent in the Temple of Dender. And in the night, he would project footage of the Met's excavations of the temple and other objects that are in the galleries. So again, this kind of sense of critiquing or looking back at the museum's history and how these objects have arrived in a present-day condition. This is him after having moved across the museum to the threshold space, eating his dinner. Now, I have to mention is that Nikhil did not spend the nights in the galleries. He spent the nights in our auditorium on the empty stage under camera surveillance because he had to be on view by security all the time. So again, conceptually taking this notion further about an object on view and how does a body become an object, and what does it mean when a brown body or a laboring body or a migrant body is in these conditions. Here he is opposite our soloist in the threshold space. So you can see that the drawing or the fabric shape shifts, and it takes on a different kind of persona really as he moves through the performance. And so it was against a wall, and here he is making the land portion of the drawing. And he was also very interested in this body mass that he saw in the Oceania galleries. And so this is his kind of reaction or response to that. And also this idea of him undergoing a transformation, being in the space of the museum. He began the performance as this migrant body, this worker in this uniform that is very legible to us all, and we see him as that. But then to kind of resist being only in that condition and to think about this process of transformation that we undergo. And so here's an image of him moving his things one by one to the last location. And so this was the final location in the Lehman Galleries, where the work took on the shape of a half panorama. Again, looking at the history of landscape painting that is in the museum, and the idea of some of it being done plein air, but he's doing it inside. For him, it's an imagined landscape, it's a memory drawing, it's a map of somewhere else, it's a map of these different places that he longs to go to or remembers or doesn't exist anymore. And what does that mean in the context of today? And the painting, this is not when it was complete, but there was a sense of it being slightly incomplete. And also him sleeping within this landscape. Seeing him sleep was one of the most challenging things for our viewers, and we had 28,000 people come to see him, and they were just like, the idea of seeing a body but not performing in the way you need it to was very challenging and engaging and traumatizing for some people. But one also wondered, or at least I was thinking, what is he dreaming of in this imagined landscape? Are these are fugitive dreams, the dreams of a migrant or someone who has no home or place? And so finally, Nikhil changes into his last persona into a kind of amorphous, more robe-like costume, and has this mask. So basically totally obscuring not only his being, his gender, his ethnicity, transforming into a kind of alien-like post-human body. And he would crawl from the Lehman court over a process of an hour and a half to the Great Hall, or where he started, and where he brought his things in. He ends by collapsing and dying. And he lay there as the entire museum was cleaned of all its visitors. So he was left then entombed in the collective memory of the museum. And so that's how the performance ended. And so really what was very exciting about this project was the ability to bring live art into the historic galleries, to see an artist interface with the historic collections, the museum's legacy, its own organizational logic, in a way that hasn't happened before. It was completely unprecedented. And so just the 3 projects that I've shared with you in which I've realized the commission, the exhibition, and the live performance all talk about different ways of engaging the museum space, interrogating the museum as a space of neutrality and authority, and what does it mean to start engaging with the modern and contemporary practice of a region in a belated manner, and asking those questions through not only our exhibition program and special projects, but also through acquisitions and how they can be embodied. And so I think for me, it's really been moving between these registers and creating an almost constant presence in the museum for the region that has been challenged, but also greatly satisfying. And I think I'll end it at that. I have no sense of time as to whether I've spoken more or less, but I'm just going to leave it at that. But thank you very much.
What the Met represents as a museum, and for all of us thinking about it, it's the prime example of an encyclopedic museum shaped around the 19th century model of civics, civilization, of taste and refinement, of wealth, and its cultivation, and in many ways of empire. And something that I was really struck by many of these projects is maybe an element or a perceived aesthetic clash that seemed to be really important into the context of the frame of your presentation of these artworks. It seemed really important and interesting. How do you think these projects are helping to shift the notion of the institution, not necessarily totally transforming it, but how do you think it's helping the institution exist in the now?
I think one of the axes for the modern and contemporary program, as defined and developed by Sheena, is to articulate to audiences how contemporary practitioners look to the historic, but interpreted within an idiom that is of the moment, maybe using materials that are very much of the moment. And so I think the aesthetic clash, but works that have relationships to the historic material, is something that is a conscious decision in a way, to be like, there is an endurance of the past into the present, but it is so wholly transformed, and how that relation is, it doesn't have to be literal in its evocation of what is inspiring about the past. And also, there are certain aesthetic standards that have defined the writing of our art history and our canon, and by trying to engage work and bring to notice work that shifts those criterias may perhaps speak to the broader shift that we're having, or we see in our field, which is rethinking what are those classifications that are appropriate for a certain work, that the classifications of certain attributes of work should have to have it be acknowledged and admitted into a particular canon. And also the artists who were even ahistorically, like Mukherjee or Mohammadi in their context, were working outside of what were the prevailing aesthetic conditions in that moment or in their social milieu, weren't acknowledged in those histories. So how even in that moment there was something of that kind of removal or marginalization happening. So I really do see that the international program, and not only what we've been doing with South Asia, but in the rest of the program also, is rethinking certain kind of categories and boundaries, and resonating with what is happening within the field more broadly.
So that actually brings me to the performance and thinking about different personas, and actually your transition from being a curator of exhibition and then planning a project into the public space. And how did you change your mode of working, and what were the things that you were surprised by or unprepared for, or opportunities to actually help shift your practice?
It was the first performance work I've curated, and it has left me a little bit exhausted and challenged, because one is no longer just dealing with objects that are sitting there and kind of, you're dealing with the capriciousness and the precariousness of something unfolding in time. And as I mentioned, Nikhil's project was quite unprecedented for the museum, because there has been live art in the galleries, but it's more responsive and duration, in the sense that it started at a certain time and it ended at another moment. And it wasn't the act of having a body in a space, sometimes mostly for long stretches of time, doing nothing. And, I think it was, getting, once he integrated himself into the museum in his research and devised what he wanted to do and where he wanted to be, to get the host of people in the museum to kind of accommodate him. And it isn't just the curators or the collections managers, but also scientific, conservation, buildings, security, custodial, all these different groups, member services, docents, guides, who needed to be engaged and briefed as to how to introduce something that is happening in the museum to our audiences who are not accustomed to coming upon that. So the various acts of exchange or diplomacy that one had to use to get everybody to agree to allow him to do what he wanted to do was, I think, one of the most challenging but also exciting parts of the project, because it also opened the museum up to me in a way that I had not engaged with it. And I met more colleagues. I thought about what my other colleagues do, and it became, their practices in the museum became more aware to me in a way that they perhaps might not have been fully manifest for me.
I had the privilege of actually seeing part of the performance at the temple, and there was this moment, one of these questions kind of came out of how you need to negotiate in real time those elements. So we sat down by the temple, and then I saw two of your colleagues come and start chattering away, and my friend and I were both reacting to that. We're like, oh, we should get up, and I was like, no, stay here, occupy the space, let's see what happens, because we didn't want to leave the space unoccupied for things to change. What behaviors might be allowed or not allowed was a really interesting moment. I've only experienced it by staging performances here, and to be in some other institution and being able to read that was really thrilling for me. Something else first I have to say, it was such a privilege to spend time thinking and reading about the work, some of which I've seen that you've presented at the Met, some of which I hadn't. And one of the things that really struck me was how so many of the projects actively raised political, social, and environmental concerns, and not in a roundabout way, in a more direct way. And I'm curious how these topics are both part of your curatorial practice, but in terms of a changing institution like the Met, how they're part of a bigger vision now and what that looks like.
I think for me, at least when I was offered the opportunity to do the roof, and it was 2018, it was coming off the election year, and it's a social space. We have 500,000 visitors come through it, and talking through the positioning and of artwork in a public space at the museum with my colleagues, I think we, as a department, feel the imperative that to engage our audiences and or have them think about and see that art is reflective and reactive to what is happening around them, and how that can be translated. And that's what made Huma such a kind of exciting choice for that moment, because the work was deeply political, but also offered other modes of entry for audiences. So it didn't exist purely in one modality. And for me as a curator, I'm interested in the experience of work that while socially or culturally having a consciousness, it also has a strong material integrity or a formal integrity. And having, say, Ranjani's installation of 7 ponds and a few raindrops on view concurrently with Huma's work on the top, in the roof, there were 2 artists who work alone, materially, sculptors, making their work by themselves in very different aesthetic registers. But also, there are different ways in which people will apprehend them, and also make the museum a space of, I wanted to demonstrate that the Met can do contemporary programming at quite a significant level, and engage with different ideas and different aesthetic modalities. And I think for me, it is always finding work that moves between these 2 registers and that allows a broader engagement with audience. It doesn't necessarily alienate an audience member if they're not engaged formally or politically with the work, but can find another way into it. And you said there was a second part to the question. So that was about me as a curator, and then about the institution more broadly.
Yeah, maybe in terms of in context of the department, or is it in line with or in contrast to the bigger vision for the modern and contemporary?
I think it's very much in line with our vision. I think, the program that we evolved at Breuer, even, the current facade commission by Vangechi Mutu, or my colleague Claire's project with Rhiann Tabbitt, which is an intervention in the ancient Near East galleries, all of them speak to the present, but have a different kind of, they occupy a different space aesthetically, and that is a way of accommodating our audiences and not pushing them away, because the Met has never been traditionally the space for this kind of work. And it's not only about engaging our existing audience, but also the newer communities of viewers and visitors that we're bringing into the museum with the kind of work we're doing. It's building audiences. That's something that, I didn't talk about, but really a part of being at the department at the time I joined, and a revised modern and contemporary program, is creating community and engaging with communities that weren't generally part of the museum's audience.
I think with that, I want to open up the conversation to all of you for your questions, because, while this is really interesting for me, I'm sure that you all have your own burning questions. So we have time for 3.
I wanted to ask you how the audiences reacted to the installation, the second one that you talked about.
The Mukherjee.
No, not the Mukherjee, the
Nikhil Chopra.
Yes.
We had a range of responses, but I think initially it was beguiling, but then because it was 9 days and it was durational, what was quite thrilling was to see people come back and sit and engage and really try to understand what he was doing. And you could just come for one moment and you would think that you understand that this is part of a larger narrative, and then it remains incomplete in your head, same way the drawing remains incomplete, or the idea of the life of a nomadic person remains in a constantly iterative condition. And so people came by multiple times. Some people found it very meditative to just see a person drawing and being. Others were a little bit more confrontational about it. So we got a range of reactions and responses to the work. But I think the most thrilling was really to see people when he was sleeping, just sitting there and watching him sleep. It reminded, I think, a lot of the viewers, and some of them left comments because we were handing out visitor cards, that art is made, it's living, it's made by living people, and art has a life to it. They're not just entombed objects. There is a sense of life to these things, and I think that was one of the wonderful things we could have achieved as a response from the project. And just one thing, everybody was very respectful of him. So no one tried to kind of invade his space, because that was a concern in terms of security about whether people would cross the threshold, go into his tent, or try to displace him. But everybody was very respectful, which was great.
I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. From your own perspective, and for artists that are existing today, and for the future of your audiences at the museum, are you seeing other artists that use the shifting of perspectives with history and contemporary ideas? I don't know if that's clear enough for you. I mean, you presented a man who interprets the history.
Yeah.
And myself, being a creative person, I often thought about integrating other cultures into my work with music. But do you see other art? Do you think you have a stall of artists that you could draw from, that you can continue the work that you're doing and pioneering at the museum?
I believe so. I think so much of contemporary artistic practice today is very much in conversation with the historic past, but it can be from any part of the 5,000 years that we have at the museum. And I think that we have artists responding maybe sometimes more to the social, cultural implications of a work, but then others thinking about it in formal terms. And so you have different registers of how artists are responding to the collection, or to the idea of also even being part of a continuum of artistic the act of being part of a continuum of making work as well. So I think that's what's thrilling for us, is that sometimes the references are not as obvious. The interpretations are more latent in the work, and drawing those out. And maybe sometimes it is not even totally legible to our audiences, and maybe even to us, or the works reveal themselves in differing ways. And I think that's the exciting thing about programming at the Met, and something that we can do that sets us apart from some of our peer institutions who are exclusively modern and contemporary institutions. So their spaces, their gallery spaces, their collections are very different. They don't allow for that kind of exploration. And really all the commissions and special projects are dialogues with the artists. They're dialogues with colleagues in other departments, because I don't have the specialist knowledge that my colleague in another department would. So to facilitate that introduction between an artist and another colleague, and to see where that leads to. So the ability to be in a generative condition is, I think, one of the most thrilling aspects of the modern and contemporary program as it's evolved at the Met.
Are there?
The project with Nikhil Chopra, again, I was wondering if there was a video of the performance, and I was reminded of Christo's Running Fence film of the whole process there, with him negotiating with all kinds of people besides art historians and curators.
There isn't a video, but there is a lot of photographic documentation, and we're hoping to find a way of making that accessible. But in most of Nikhil's installation pieces, once they're represented, so currently there's a work on view at SF MoMA in the Soft Power show, there is a Steadicam footage alongside the drawing that show the process of the performance. So we do have footage like that. So when and if the Met just choose to acquire his drawing and the residues of the performance and how we configure it, there could be video documentation of that.
Oh, me. I'm gonna, do you want to finish it up, Mark, and then I'll say a last word?
Well, I guess to thank you so much for your time and presentation and entertaining our questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.